Okay, good evening, guys. I've logged on a little bit early before 6. I hope you're having a good night. Got a laptop set up tonight. I'm just trying to work out where the actual camera settings are. But anyway, I will look that way, look this way, look into it. Thanks for logging on tonight. And I know we're a little bit early, but I see that there's a lot of questions coming in already. And Dave, you've really started with a really very complex question there. Can we please open on the following issues: the gas theft issue, the housing crisis, the issue of usury and reserve banking, and the issue of our government. Well, I wouldn't say that they're licking the boots of Israel. I will say that we need to make sure we just focus on Australia, notwithstanding that we want to end the cycle of violence anywhere in the world. And I know, that's a diplomatic answer, but we just got to get focused on issues here in Australia on that last one in terms of cost of living and housing. But I'll come back to your first questions, the gas theft. Okay, so we have got to change the way we charge a petroleum resource rent tax. So what we have in Australia, we have onshore gas, which the state governments charge a royalty on. And Western Australia, for example, have a reservation policy. People First will also have a reservation policy when it comes to gas. And we will also, we're proposing to abolish the petroleum resource rent tax and replace it with a flat 5% royalty so that the multinationals can't play games with the way they manipulate their accounts. So that's our intention there, is to and this is, of course, is only in regards to the federal gas. So that is gas that is drilled in offshore waters, not onshore gas. So onshore gas is already charged a royalty. Obviously, there is the issue here in Queensland, for example. A lot of contracts were sold very early on to Japan very cheaply. Now, that's a little bit of that. That's not necessarily corruption. Often when you see capital, you do want to lock some sales in, guarantee the price to get the capital. Now, over time, that will roll off. But we also need to make sure that as these projects get developed, that future projects, now that a lot of the infrastructure is in place, we do get our pound of flesh, and we should do that through the use of royalties on the top line as well. And can I say, our coal miners, for example, pay a lot of money. So especially here in Queensland, they do pay quite significant royalties, especially if the coal price goes up. So it really only applies to offshore gas, because I think a lot of people think that happens. It applies to wall gas. It doesn't apply to wall gas. One of the reasons why we have to re-import gas at the moment is that Victoria and New South Wales refused to do onshore drilling. And if they did onshore drilling, you would find that, and had a gas reservation policy that goes with it, you would find that we'd be able to use a lot more gas in Australia. And that's one of the reasons why gas is so expensive, because we don't actually drill for enough gas here in Australia. New South Wales and Victoria, for example, have banned it. And that then means that they then have to turn around and rely on gas imports, which is completely absurd, that we export gas from Queensland and then they're talking about now using it again in re-importing it in New South Wales and Victoria. Housing crisis. Look, there's a lot of reasons for that. The first and major reason is the immigration issue, whereby we have had for the last 2 years approximately over 500,000 immigrants in each year. We've had over 1 million people since the Albanese government got into power in May 22. That is completely unsustainable. You just cannot build enough houses, notwithstanding that the number of new houses being built has also been falling while immigration has been rising. But it's important to understand how this immigration issue came about. It really kicked off in December 2008 when Kevin Rudd, when he was Prime Minister, allowed the parents of foreign students to buy houses here. Now, he did that while it seemed like, not a lot of people joined the dots back at the time, the reason why they did that was in the GFC, and there was a lot of uncertainty around the stability of the financial markets and therefore the housing market. And it was a sop to the major banks, our lovely major banks who get bailed out all the time whenever there's a crisis. So much for the free market. Having said that, I mean, you don't want our major banks to collapse, but the idea that these guys are actually competing with each other is a joke. They're actually extremely protected species in this country. But that came about, the debt crisis in 2008 came about because in 1985, Paul Keating lifted capital controls. And in 1985, the four major banks had $8 billion in foreign debt. By 2008, they had $800 billion in foreign debt. That drove the price of houses from about 3 to 4 times average earnings up to about 10 to 12 times average earnings. And as a result of that, two parents had to go back to work. And that is also why the childcare industry started to take off in the late 90s and early noughties, was because two parents had to go back to work to pay the mortgage, because Paul Keating lifted capital controls in 1985 that allowed domestic banks to go and borrow money from offshore. And the problem with that is when the banks did that, that meant that house prices were no longer tied to earnings, they were tied to capital inflows. And that's very, very important. It's always, assets have to be tied to earning capacity, because if it's not tied to earning capacity and it's allowed to inflate relative to earnings capacity, while that might be good for the current generation who's experiencing an asset inflation and an asset wealth gain, which is all very good for the current generation, the next generation that comes along is suddenly priced out of the housing market. And that's what we're seeing now, is that initial housing boom that took off in the 90s. It was sort of mid to late 90s, and Howard poured fuel on the fire, by the way, by bringing in the 50% CGT discount. That then inflated house prices over and beyond what people could afford to pay for them. And of course, one generation made a lot of money out of this, all tax-free, of course, because houses for a lot of people are tax-free. But it's caused a problem in the next generation, which, of course, are the young people coming through now. And, of course, not only have they got a problem with housing, they've got a problem with saving, because 12% of their income is actually taken from them and given to someone they've never met. Now, you say, so if you're on $100,000 and you're losing $12,000 of it to, superannuation, and you lose another $50,000, and if you're doing well if you can live on $50,000 in a major capital city at least these days, and you pay about $20 on $88,000, you'd pay about $20,000 tax or thereabouts. Suddenly, you've had your saving capacity halved. So $100,000 earnings, you have $12,000 gone in super, $50,000 in living costs, another $20,000 in taxation. That's $82,000. You've now left with $18,000. If you didn't have superannuation, you'd have $30,000. So superannuation for many people, especially if you're on less than 100,000, is actually taking away people's ability to save up for a housing loan. So not only have house prices risen, your capacity to save and get into the housing market is much harder. And now I haven't even touched on debt yet. HECS yet. So that is a large part of the reason for the housing crisis. We need lower immigration. We need capital controls to ensure that house prices remain a function of earnings, average earnings, and not a function of foreign capital, because there's no limit. The amount of capital out there on the US Treasury bond market's in the trillions. So you've only got to get a slither of the share of the foreign capital market coming here and going into Australia's housing market, and you will, cause a housing boom, which is what we've seen over the last 20 years. And like I said, while it's good for the current generation who, experiences an asset boom, the next generation, it's kind of like your body, you could turn, two people were going to a party. One person went to the party and got to drink and everything and have a great time, but another person had to wake up with a hangover. And that's what's happened now, is that really the younger generation is waking up with the hangover of the housing boom. And look, just to get on that last issue, we need to stay focused on issues here in Australia. I think I'm amazed at how much attention's been given to the crisis in Israel and Gaza, notwithstanding. I think the cycle of violence has to end there. and there needs to be serious questions about what took place on October the 7th. And mind you, there should be serious questions about the protesters here as well. Regardless of what your view is, you need to behave responsibly in this country if you want to get your point across, because the moment you start engaging in violence, you lose the argument very, very quickly. Thanks for that, Pascal. I appreciate your support there. Gary, can I vote if you live in New South Wales? We're working on getting candidates in New South Wales. I haven't got them selected yet. We have had plenty of people apply, and we're working on it. So you can't vote for me directly, but it would be good if you could vote for people first. I think I like what our party has to offer. We're a party of solutions, not grievances. We've got a very comprehensive range of policies. We are continually working on more policies as people advise us. I mean, there's some issues, for example, we haven't yet touched on around family law and that, which is obviously very hard to make policies for, because it's very hard. One size fits all when it comes to things like family law. But just know some of the feedback I've got is some people think that I haven't done enough to protect the family. I accept that, governments want to protect the family. It's just very hard to make specific laws other than general laws, like make sure that, families don't pay too much tax. They choose the type of childcare they want. They get to keep their superannuation so they can pay their house off, their mortgage off quicker. They're the sort of things that we want to do to empower families. And that is indeed one of our core philosophies, is to empower the families and individuals and hold the unrestrained power of the Constitution, of the institutions to account. Greg, Gary, that's a good point about the overpriced and incompetent NDIS. I have touched on that a few times about how the NDIS system's being rorted, especially by private equity. It's really how on earth private equity are moving on into the NDIS. There's got to be something wrong with the system whereby the private equity players are investing in NDIS, and I think that's a real concern. I'm not convinced that outsourcing a lot of these NDIS services is the right way to go, notwithstanding, governments aren't very good at doing sort of domestic things. I mean, their responsibility is obviously for infrastructure and providing essential services, but that tailored care and attention, we need to make sure that we really encourage family members to step up there when it comes to NDIS. I know many do already. I'm not saying they don't. Okay, so there's a few questions there about biology. I'm not sure it's a comment more than a question. I'll just go back up. I constantly talk about the spike protein. That's correct. Okay, Neo Mortal Girl. Really worried about Australia adopting too much American crap right now. Look, I'm not quite sure what you mean. There's obviously a wave of, against the woke agenda, if I could call it that. I think people have had have had enough of, just all the woke garbage that's been going around the last few years, and I think the tide's turning. So I'm not sure that that's an American thing. I think that that's plenty of Australians don't need to take their advice or tips from America. I think they genuinely just get tired of constantly being lectured to by the left about woke issues when they really think the government should stay focused on cost of living, immigration and housing and energy. How do we get politicians to be accountable, Eric? Well, the best way to do that is get involved in politics, and that means more than just sharing posts on social media or posting comments on social media. You really need to join a political party. I'd love you to join People First, but you don't have to join People First, and start selecting good candidates to go into Parliament. It's amazing the number of people that aren't prepared to put their hand up. And I get it, like not everyone's in a situation where they can, but we really need people to volunteer in the election process, run as a candidate, make a donation, hand out how to vote cards or flyers, but get involved in the democratic process. It's only as good as the energy, what you get out of democracy. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It is an active participant sport, and it is incumbent upon every Australian at various times throughout their life when they can find the time to get involved, or Australia will go backwards. There's no question about that whatsoever. Why won't all the minor parties join forces? And if they do, will that be enough to form a government and hold power, just like the Lib Labs do? Not at the moment. That what they could do, and what we're working on, I've certainly approached a few other parties, is to have a bit of a coalition. What we need to do in the first step is become a minor party in the Senate, because the Senate is based on proportional representation. And what that means is if you get 14% of the vote, you will get an equivalent of one senator. If you get 28% of the vote, you'll get two senators. Whereas in the lower house, once a particular party gets the 50% 2PP, first past the post, they get that total position for that particular lower house. So technically speaking, you could have a major party, Liberal or Labor, get 51% of the vote in every seat in Australia and end up with 100% of the parliamentarians if they won every seat but only won it by 1%. Now, it doesn't usually turn out like that, but if you take Queensland, for example, the Liberal Party get around 52, 53% of the 2PP. They hold on to almost 70% of the seats here in Queensland. So that's what 2PP does, whereas the Senate, on the other hand, is proportional. If you get 50% of the vote, you'll only ever get 3 out of the 6 senators. So we want to start with the minor parties aiming for a position in the Senate, step one, where we get senators from every state at every election cycle. So we get 12 senators. And then we want to hope to get the balance of power when the Liberals are in power, so that we can hold them to account. And, for example, we need to, get out of the Paris Agreement, for example, and walk away from net zero. It's killing us. It's going to destroy our energy. Renewables are going to destroy our energy grid as well as our environment. And in doing so, they will destroy our economy. So, there's no reason why Australia is still in net zero or Paris, when China and India, and I think Russia as well, and now the USA aren't even in it. It's ridiculous that we're in it. And, if you look at the countries that are in it, Europe's going backwards at a rate of knots. Their industrial base is declining, as is ours, I should say. And we need to, start to put the Australian interests first. Zero immigration removal, temporary visa holders, Lee 93. Well, look, over time, I think the temporary visa holders, if we don't renew them, will have to go home. So as their visa expires, I agree that it should go home. I don't think we should necessarily remove all 1.6 million or whatever right this second, or I think we'd suddenly have a labour crisis. But if they slowly roll off over the next 2 or 3 years, I certainly would support that. I don't have People First doesn't have a zero immigration policy. We have less than 100,000 immigration policy, because there will be times, through family circumstances or whatever, whereby some people will need to immigrate or whatever. But we definitely want to keep new immigration to less than 100,000 a year. Especially now, China. Coffee time. By all means, type in your question. How does Qatar do it? That's from Timber, Crete and Steel. Now, the reason why Qatar does it is that their gas is of a higher quality and much more shallow, and their fields are much bigger. So the gas in Australia, especially the offshore gas up there in the Western Australia, in those basins, are very deep. And it's a lot more expensive, both in the actual geology / engineering process to get the gas out of the ground, and it's also a lot more expensive in regards to labour costs. So I had a mate, this was over a decade ago, who worked up there in that off those offshore gas platforms, and I think he wasn't super qualified, but he was on something like over 300 grand a year. because that is super hot up there in the Northwest Shelf. The conditions are very hard. It's fly in, fly out. You're away from your family for about 3 weeks at a time. So our costs here are more expensive, and the quality of the gas doesn't. We've got to also ship it further. So Qatar's right there in the hub of Asia and not too far from Europe. And I actually looked. This was one of the first things I looked into when I became a senator almost 6 years ago now. Was with the Parliamentary Library, because I wanted to do something about the petroleum resource rent tax. I've actually realised it's easier just to get rid of the resource rent tax and apply a flat 5% royalty, so they can't play funny buggers with the books. But that's why Qatar does it. They're a much smaller country as well, so the percentage of royalties they get from their gas is obviously going to go a lot further in a country, and I'm not sure what their population is at 5 million. And their people, their workers are paid much, much less, and they get paid. Their gas gets a lot more, gets a much higher price because it's a sweeter type of gas, and it's a more of a liquid type of gas, which I think is worth more as well. So there's some of the reasons why we don't make as much money on our offshore gas. But I should note we do make a lot of money from iron ore and coal, and it's incumbent upon the Western Australian and Queensland governments and the New South Wales governments not to squander that money, and they have been squandering that money for a long time. And even Victoria with their brown coal, there's no reason why they can't just use that locally at least, because their footprint there it's very, very small. So we should, So when you say there, Timber, that they made some 70 billion last year, like our iron ore exports and coal exports are over 100 billion each. But where we do go wrong is and this is one of the things with that gas issue, is many people focus on the petroleum resource rent tax, but they're not focusing on the withholding tax on the interest, royalties and rent paid offshore. Now, Chevron got busted off, I think it was about a decade ago now, whereby they were paying interest offshore at a rate of 9% on the intercompany loan, and their average cost of borrowing was around 2%. Now, the only reason Chevron got caught was they actually, when the ATO subpoenaed their records, there was an actual email that said, they designed it to shift profits. They literally got caught in the act with not a handwritten email, but a written email that said that the 9% was way above the transfer pricing that should have been applied to that particular intercompany loan. So that's the other thing. And it's not just gas. So a lot of people love to criticise the mining companies and primary production companies for shifting profits offshore. And in some respects, that's true. But they're all companies, as I've pointed out in estimates and in the chamber. Pfizer made 1.4 billion in sales in 2022, pumped $1 billion offshore to Ireland. Meta pumps billions offshore to Ireland. And there's other companies. I was speaking to a guy recently who works out on the ports of Brisbane, and he was saying one of his competitors, a foreign-owned company, shifts enormous amount of money in interest, royalties and rent offshore. And that was actually one of the reasons why General Motors and our manufacturing companies went broke, because they became foreign-owned. General Motors would shift all the profits involved in manufacturing, or a lot of the profits involved in manufacturing, offshore. So they shifted money, interest, royalties, management fees, license fees, because by shifting it all offshore, it meant that they didn't have to pay tax here, because if they declare an income here, they have to pay 30 cents in the dollar. And actually back in the late 90s, I think it was actually 36 cents in the dollar, whereas our tax treaties were only, especially with American tax treaties, on some of those treaties, the withholding tax rate on interest, royalties and rent is 0. So why would you keep a profit here in Australia if you can shift it offshore via doing some journal entries and shifting your profits offshore? So what I call above the line profits. So when there was this argument going around that the car companies weren't making money, no one ever actually asked the question, how much in interest, royalties and rent did the car companies shift offshore? And I can tell you how much it was. It was enough to make sure they never made a profit here. And as I just did a post this morning, I don't know if it's up on YouTube yet, I posted it up on Facebook. the ATO hasn't updated their tax treaty with Ireland since 1983. Now, back in 1983, Ireland had a tax treaty of tax rate of 40 cents, and I think Australia's tax rate, I certainly know around 1980 it was 48 cents. So it beggars belief that the ATO isn't going through and keeping an eye on all these other companies' domestic tax rate to make sure, because I can tell you, big companies have tax accountants that sit there and look for the hole in the cheese type scenario, where they're always looking at countries that are lowering the tax rate to shift their profits to, so that they don't have to pay tax here in Australia. So so with the gas, it's a good question. It's something we need to do, but it's something that we need to apply across the board. It's not just gas. And if there's a reason, if you really care about it, People First is the party to vote for, because I've got a master's in tax law. I also have a master's of applied finance, and I've worked in multinationals overseas and here, multinationals here in Australia at Westfield. I've worked at Bank of Queensland in Treasury as a Treasury accountant, and as a Treasury accountant in Westfield, along with some tax at Westfield. So I understood the tax structuring there. I also worked for a company based out of Amsterdam. So I know how this system works, and I know how to fill the holes, to plug the holes, and that is to lift the tax rate offshore. I've just got to, just bear with me for a minute. Just got to put a charger on this thing. Sorry, I'm going to lose my battery. Okay, great. Okay, I'm just bear with me. I'll be back in a jiffy. Hey guys. Sorry about that, guys. I've just got to get a plug the. I think it must be that one there. Is that plugged in? Not sure why not. Anyway, guys, I'll go on with the next question. And got about 8 minutes remaining. Uh-oh, now it's locked. Great.